There are a few patterns within people and within relationships that lead a person to flipping, that is, to suddenly change to the opposite. When you find yourself in the scenario, it is especially painful, disorienting, and confusing. For this reason, today I'm going to reveal one of the most common patterns that causes a person to flip in a relationship. And I'm going to reveal why this pattern spells drastic change for your relationship, no matter what. It's tempting to think that the majority of relationships are functional and that dysfunctional relationships are the rarity, but the reverse is actually true. Most relationships between people on Earth today fall somewhere on the scale of dysfunction, and the vast majority of the dysfunction in relationships is about how to be in relationships with other people and their best interests while maintaining a sense of our self and our personal best interests. In dysfunctional family systems, we learn that we cannot trust other people to truly act in our best interests. We have to vie for our own best interests and create adaptations to that family system so that we can feel as safe as possible and so that we can have as much control as possible over getting our own needs met. There are so many different strategies that children learn to employ in order to do this. Before a child selects these various strategies, they're faced with a choice. One, they can go through the front door and fight the other members of the family system for their own best interests, or two, they can go through the back door and manipulate the other members of the family system for their own best interests. And it's here that people develop the relationship strategy of narcissism or codependency. The truth about narcissism and codependency is that they are not personality disorders. They are adaptive relationship strategies. If you want to learn more about this, you can watch my video that's titled The Truth About Narcissism and Codependency. People who develop the relationship adaptation style of codependency decide at a subconscious level that because no one is really concerned for their welfare, benefit, and best interests, the best way to survive and to get their own needs met is by sacrificing parts of themselves so as to conform to other people's best interests and create an attuned emotional contract with them, whereby their own needs are manipulatively met in exchange for doing so. You will hear pretty much everywhere that codependents place a lower priority on their own needs, while being excessively preoccupied with the needs of others. This is not true at all. It only looks like that on the outside. The reality is that the preoccupation with the needs of others is their method for getting their own needs met. This codependent relational adaptation carries on into adulthood. It causes them to flip in relationships. The codependent flip pattern is when someone enters into a relationship and creates a false sense of confluence with that person, even if doing so requires things like sacrificing parts of themselves, suppressing personal truths, and saying yes to what's actually a no for them, because they believe that doing so promises to meet their needs in some way. They have all kinds of subconscious, or conscious but unexpressed, expectations. But when their strategy doesn't work to actually get their needs met, the truth comes out. They drop their strategy. They essentially dupe the other person. The fact that certain things were a sacrifice and certain things were not actually true or a yes for them comes out. They then begin to flip into a narcissistic style of relating to the other person because they have no frame of reference for any other style of relating to other people. And what's more than that, they now expect the other person to do for them what they did for that other person in the beginning, i.e. to sacrifice for their best interests, to say yes to what's a no for them, and to suppress parts of themselves. Essentially, to reverse the entire dynamic by becoming codependent to them. So that you can understand this pattern better, here's an example. Bruce has a codependent relational style. He fell in love with a very beautiful woman named Bryn. Bruce was awestruck by Bryn, and he saw Bryn as the ticket to his increased self-esteem, the self-esteem that he lacked, and also as a perfect way to feel a sense of belonging and power, and also emotional closeness and physical intimacy. Bryn preferred him to be with her all the time, so he quit his job and worked for her in her company. Bryn had a particular music taste, let's say, so he just let her control the music that they listened to. Bryn wanted to buy a house and didn't trust any man enough to want his name on the mortgage, so Bruce said yes to paying rent and living with her in her house. Bryn wanted dogs also, so Bruce not only said he wanted them too, he surprised her with a puppy. Bryn felt like she had met a true friend, like a kindred soul, someone who is such a kindred soul, he was basically family. But the reality is that Bruce was simply creating a sense of confluence and was only pleasing Bryn with his own subconscious needs in mind. Specifically, Bruce expected Bryn to become his partner on a romantic and sexual level. He expected her to publicly introduce him as her boyfriend. He expected her to eventually make him part owner in her company as well. Bruce had duped Bryn. Bryn would go on dates with other men. She would quickly set people straight if they assumed that she and Bruce were together as a couple. And one day, she explained that she wanted to transition him out of his role within the company so that somebody else who's even more qualified than them both could come in and take over. This was a way of making the company expand. All of this, quite frankly, insulted Bruce. And gradually, Bruce started to realize that everything he had given himself up for wasn't going to happen. Now he felt resentful and full of rage. Rather than seeing that he is accountable for saying yes to what was really a no for him and to sacrificing what he was not actually okay sacrificing, and for misleading Bryn to think that they were compatible where they actually weren't, etc., Bruce decided that Bryn was using him all along, that she only cared about herself, and that he needed to do something that was best for him for once. So out of the blue, Bruce flipped. He told Bryn that he expected a portion of her company for all the years of dedication that he'd shown to her business, their business. He told her that he thought it was wrong that she owned a house that he had been paying rent to when all along he could have been owning his own house and been paying down the mortgage on his own asset rather than hers. He started blasting the music that he loved, but Bryn hated. And he started dropping his responsibilities for the puppy as a passive-aggressive way of asserting the truth that he only said yes to the dogs because he wanted to please her to get his own needs met. And when she got upset about it, rather than to immediately give into his zero-sum game demands by sacrificing her best interests for his best interests and saying yes to what is actually a no for her and suppressing parts of herself, because in Bruce's mind, that would be the good and the right thing to do, Bruce went on a triangulation tour. He told every person they mutually knew that Bryn was a complete narcissist who had taken him for granted for years and who had wronged him and had prevented him from his own success for years. Bruce was convinced that by flipping, he was becoming more empowered and he was healing. But what had actually happened is that he had swung the pendulum and he had slipped into the codependent flip pattern. To learn more about the pendulum swing pattern that often happens with healing, you can watch my video titled, "What is the Pendulum Swing in Healing?" Bruce and Bryn ended their relationship after years and years of being the closest people in each other's lives as bitter enemies. When people find themselves confronted with this particular pattern, they feel completely bamboozled. The reason being that at first, they don't understand why the person has suddenly changed, usually to the opposite of what they were. And after they understand the why, they feel bamboozled because what they thought was true about the other person, and therefore what they thought that they could depend on, was actually false. This pattern causes history to be rewritten. It can do no other, including the narrative about who the person they were in a relationship with is or is not. The personal truth underneath this pattern is this: I did all this for you, even though I led you to believe I was getting something out of it, and even though I said it was a yes for me, it wasn't. Now I'm dropping the act. And because I did all that for you, it's your turn to do fill in the blank for me. The codependency flip pattern is a form of entrapment in a relationship. It's to coerce somebody into an energy exchange that they may never have said yes to if they were presented with the exchange directly. It's to give up the self with a hidden expectation to get something undisclosed back. And when the other person figures it out, it's too late for them to say no. In fact, if they say no, there are consequences. The reason that people with a codependent relational style do this is because they've learned that they cannot have themselves and have the other person too. So they must give themselves up in order to get. They feel they can't put themselves and their needs on the table directly, and so they must not do so, and instead entrap the other person into meeting their needs or manipulate the other person into getting their needs met. The very unfortunate truth is that because the codependency flip pattern involves inauthenticity, from the get-go, the relationship is changing no matter what you do. It's never going back to what it was. What it wasn't actually real. This is very hard to accept if you're on the other side of this pattern, most especially because people with a codependent relational style have become, quite frankly, so good at perceiving other people's needs that they put up an act that is so wanted and so needed by you that it will feel like letting go of the very thing that you were always desperately looking for. But here's what you got to know. Having had it was an illusion. Codependency in and of itself is an extremely painful relationship strategy, and the codependent flip pattern is one of the most painful patterns that someone can experience in a relationship. It's a pattern that destroys trust in a way that drastically affects a person's belief in their own ability to discern, as well as their trust regarding all future relationships. If you notice that you fall more towards the codependent side of the spectrum in your relationships, it's important to know that the only reliable way to not fall into this pattern is to get into a relationship with the actual truth of who you are, to say no when something's a no for you, to not sacrifice what is important to you, to not feign compatibility where there is incompatibility, and also to master the practice of win-win in a relationship. It sounds easy, but the reality is that it's not going to be easy, because it's the exact opposite of the way that you learn to engage in relationships, and for a good reason. Now, if you're watching this and you realize that you've fallen into this pattern yourself, the way out of it is to admit that you fell into this pattern and take radical accountability for it. Often this means taking responsibility for cleaning up the emotional and even practical mess that was created by falling into this pattern. It is bad enough for the other person to have been duped. They don't deserve to be made a bad guy on top of it because you feel like you lost yourself in the relationship and because your unexpressed needs weren't met. The next step is to let go of your unexpressed expectations. They will never be met. Period. The end. Because you never gave the other person the chance to consciously agree to them. In fact, they more than likely agree to the exact opposite. From there, if the other person wants to associate with you rather than to end the relationship altogether, you need to renegotiate a new kind of relationship from the ground up. I mean completely from scratch, based on what is real and based on the actual points of compatibility between you and them. I'm going to say it again. The hardest thing to accept about the codependent flip pattern is that what you thought was true for the other person wasn't actually true for them, and the relationship you thought you had with them, you didn't actually have. And because of this, the relationship you have with them is changing, no matter what. You are starting over from scratch with getting to know who they really are and with a totally different relationship. Have a good week.